When a legendary icon steps into the lion's den, the outcome is never predictable. What was meant to be a viral takedown on national television spirals into something no one anticipated, a clash of ideals, generations, and unbreakable legacies, where only one walks away victorious. The lights of exposing the agenda burned bright, casting a sharp glow on the sleek, modern set. Every detail was meticulously designed to convey progress, challenge, and disruption. The hallmarks of Riley, Morgan's brand. Known for her razor-sharp intellect and unwavering commitment to liberal ideals, Riley had built her reputation on pushing boundaries and dissecting outdated beliefs with surgical precision. Tonight, she was ready for what she expected to be her most talked-about episode yet. Clint Eastwood was the perfect target. At 94, he was the embodiment of old Hollywood, a relic of a bygone era, as many saw it. A man of grit, silence, and unapologetic traditionalism. His presence on the show wasn't just a guest appearance. It was an opportunity. Riley believed she could unravel him, challenge his conservative views on faith and morality, and, in doing so, cement her position as a cultural force capable of dismantling even the strongest of icons. But as Eastwood shuffled onto the stage, the atmosphere shifted, subtly, almost imperceptibly at first. There was no grand entrance, no theatrical aura, just an old man with sharp eyes and a presence that was quietly thunderous. He didn't need the spotlight. It seemed to follow him naturally, as if history itself had walked onto the stage. The audience, hungry for confrontation, sensed something different. The conversation began as expected, sharp, direct, and confrontational. Riley's tone was cool and calculated, weaving between questions that were less inquiries and more accusations masked in intellect. She targeted his faith first, her words slicing into the heart of his public image. To her, Eastwood's open acknowledgement of his beliefs wasn't just outdated, it was dangerous in a world fighting for progress and inclusivity. The air thickened as she leaned in, questioning the relevance of his unwavering faith in modern society. Her words were laced with challenge, suggesting that belief in higher powers, rigid values, and the morality of yesteryears had no place in today's evolving landscape. The audience responded with subtle nods and quiet approval, a signal that the crowd was on her side, but Eastwood didn't bite. He didn't fumble for justification or lash back with defensiveness. Instead, he sat still, like an old oak unmoved by the storm. His eyes, steely and unwavering, never left hers. When he spoke, his voice was low, gravelly, and carried the weight of decades, each word deliberate, measured, and heavy with meaning. Without raising his voice, without matching her energy, Eastwood reached for something hidden beneath his shirt, a simple weathered cross hanging from a thin silver chain around his neck. His hand brushed over it briefly, almost as if grounding himself, before his gaze returned to Riley's. The room seemed to still. Cameras caught the slight tremor of his fingers brushing the cross, a symbol both fragile and indestructible in its significance. There was something sacred in the gesture, something that couldn't be debated or intellectualized away. And then came the story. His voice cut through the silence, not with aggression, but with the kind of gravity only earned through a lifetime of hardship, loss, and reflection. He spoke of a day long buried in memory, a moment during his early days in the military when death had come so close. It left its shadow imprinted on his soul. Trapped in a sinking aircraft off the coast, with nothing but the pitch-black water around him, Eastwood had faced the very real possibility of never seeing another sunrise. It was there, surrounded by the cold, crushing weight of the Pacific Ocean, that the cross was given to him by a fellow soldier who didn't survive that night, a man who handed it to him in those final moments, whispering that faith wasn't about certainty or perfection. It was about standing for something greater than yourself when all else had been stripped away. The weight of that story didn't come from dramatics. It came from the undeniable truth etched into every word. Eastwood didn't preach. He didn't need to. The room was no longer Riley's battlefield. It was Eastwood's stage, built not from arrogance, but from a life fully lived, steeped in scars and moments that couldn't be undone or challenged. By rhetoric, Riley faltered, just for a second. A blink, a shift in posture, a hesitation in her next question. It wasn't fear but realization, a sudden understanding that she wasn't just debating a belief system, she was confronting something ancient, something primal, something unbreakable. Riley tried to regain control, to steer the conversation back toward modern ideals and social progress, but the energy had shifted. The battle she had meticulously prepared for was no longer hers to command. And as the episode edged toward its conclusion, it was clear. Riley Morgan had tried to expose an agenda, but instead, she had unearthed something far more profound. The tension hung in the air like thick smoke, unspoken, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. Riley Morgan, known for her ability to dissect ideologies with surgical precision, sat unusually still for a beat too long. The cameras, ever the silent predators of vulnerability, captured every micro-expression. The slight clench of her jaw, the narrowing of her eyes, and the subtle shift in posture that betrayed what her voice wouldn't. This wasn't how the night was supposed to go. The plan had been clear from the start. This episode wasn't just another interview, it was meant to be a defining moment, a symbol of how progressive thought could dismantle the remnants of old-world values still clinging to the edges of society. Clint Eastwood was supposed to be the perfect embodiment of that outdated mindset, a relic, stubborn in his beliefs, a figurehead of conservatism ripe for intellectual challenge. But reality had a way of dismantling even the best-laid plans. Eastwood didn't gloat. He didn't revel in the small victories won by mere presence or the impact of his quietly devastating story. He simply sat back in his chair, eyes steady, the cross around his neck catching a glint of light, an ordinary object suddenly transformed into a symbol of unshakable conviction. Riley cleared her throat. The show had to go on. She wasn't about to let this slip through her fingers. Her reputation was built on resilience, on bouncing back from moments just like this. Only this wasn't just like this. "I think we can agree," she began, voice steady but carrying the slight edge of forced calm, that personal beliefs, however meaningful, shouldn't dictate societal progress. The audience responded with polite, subdued applause. It was enough to signal their loyalty to her narrative, but lacked the energy of earlier enthusiasm. The shift was palpable, but Riley was determined to claw back control. Eastwood didn't react. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, not in aggression, but in something far more unsettling: intent. His presence alone felt like gravity, pulling the conversation into territory Riley hadn't prepared for. "You see," she continued, pressing harder now, "the problem with holding on too tightly to the past is that it blinds us to the future. Your beliefs, faith, tradition, they can be comforting. But don't you think that, in today's world, they risk holding us back?" For a heartbeat, the silence returned, thick and deliberate. Eastwood's response wasn't sharp or defensive. It didn't need to be. His words were deliberate, carved from decades of experience, loss, and understanding. He spoke of change, not as an enemy, but as a constant force that didn't always require us to abandon what grounded us. He shared another memory, this time from the height of his career, a time when fame came with temptation, when values could easily erode beneath the weight of ego and excess. He talked about moments of weakness, nights spent staring at the ceiling, wondering if everything he had built was worth it. And then, the cross again. It wasn't about religion, not entirely. It was about remembering who you are when the world tries to reshape you. It was about standing firm, not out of stubbornness, but because some foundations shouldn't be compromised. Riley's jaw tightened. His words weren't just stories, they were walls, and with every sentence, she found herself pushing harder against them, only to realize they weren't walls meant to be broken. They were pillars holding something far more powerful. Isn't there danger? She pressed, her voice sharpening now. In refusing to evolve? In standing so firm that you become immovable, even in the face of progress? This time Eastwood's eyes met hers with an intensity that wasn't angry. It was pity, the kind of look that came from someone who had lived long enough to understand that some lessons couldn't be taught through debate. They had to be lived. The audience could feel it too. The energy in the room was no longer on her side. It was shifting, teetering toward something deeper, something unexpected. And then the unthinkable happened. Eastwood leaned back, resting his weathered hands on the arms of his chair, and without raising his voice, he laid out the heart of his belief. Progress without foundation is chaos. That it wasn't about refusing to evolve, it was about ensuring that evolution didn't erase the very things that gave life meaning. The words hit harder than any raised voice could have. Riley's next line caught in her throat. This wasn't the fight she had prepared for. Suddenly, she wasn't dismantling outdated beliefs. She was standing in front of a man who had lived through eras, wars, losses, and victories. A man who wasn't defending himself, but simply existing in his truth. And that somehow was more powerful than anything she could argue. But she couldn't back down. She wouldn't. Don't you think? Riley tried again, reaching for her last weapon, moral responsibility. That holding on to traditions can also justify oppression. That sometimes standing too firmly means standing in the way of those who need change the most. The room held its breath. And that's when Eastwood, without flinching, delivered the most crushing blow yet. Not through condemnation, but through compassion. He spoke about responsibility, not just to oneself, but to others. About how true strength isn't in forcing others to believe as you do, but in offering them the space to choose what they stand for. The simplicity of his words dismantled her argument not by opposition, but by reframing the very idea of belief. It wasn't about forcing values onto society. It was about having the courage to hold on to them when the world tried to convince you to let go. The audience, once firmly in Riley's corner, sat in a heavy, contemplative silence. The confrontation wasn't loud or violent. It was quieter than anyone expected, yet far more devastating. Riley's facade didn't crumble, but it cracked, just enough for the audience, and perhaps even herself, to feel the shift. The confidence she wore like armor didn't shine as brightly under the weight of Eastwood's quiet conviction. The episode was nearing its end, but the battle wasn't over. With one final glance toward the cameras, Riley took a breath, one last attempt to reclaim the ground she had lost. But deep down, something told her the battle had already been decided, not by intellectual dominance, but by something far more enduring: legacy. And as the credits began to roll, it was clear to everyone watching, this wasn't just an interview. This was history unfolding in real time, a reminder that sometimes the loudest voice in the room isn't the one shouting, but the one standing still. The studio lights dimmed as the credits rolled, their sterile glow fading into something more subdued. The audience, usually quick to rise in applause or shuffle out with murmured chatter, remained frozen in their seats. There was no grand conclusion, no triumphant fanfare. Just the heavy silence of something significant that everyone had witnessed, but few could fully comprehend in the moment. Riley Morgan sat stiff in her chair, her smile tight and professionally poised for the cameras, but her eyes betrayed her. A flicker of something raw and unfamiliar. Defeat. Not the catastrophic public kind that would send shockwaves through her career overnight, but something quieter and far more unsettling. She had faced off with a living legend, armed with every ounce of preparation, strategy, and modern ideology at her disposal. And yet, it wasn't enough. Clint Eastwood didn't gloat. He didn't offer the smug satisfaction of a man who knew he'd just won a battle. He simply sat in his chair, calm and composed, as though the weight of the moment hadn't settled on his shoulders at all. Perhaps it hadn't, because for him this wasn't a fight for relevance or dominance. It was just another conversation, another day living by the code he had carried for nearly a century. The camera lights finally blinked off, and the artificial energy that fueled the confrontation evaporated into something real. Riley turned toward Clint, her expression a little softer now, as if searching for some kind of common ground after the storm. But before she could speak, Eastwood rose from his chair with a slow, deliberate movement. His posture remained steady despite the years weighing on his body. Every line on his face a testament to battles fought far beyond this studio. The tension wasn't over. Not yet. The crew moved around them, disconnecting microphones, adjusting lights, and preparing for the next segment of the evening. Yet amidst the organized chaos, the gravity between Riley and Eastwood remained palpable. The interview was over, but the impact lingered, raw and unresolved. Finally, Riley broke the silence. "That didn't go how I expected," she admitted, her voice low and stripped of the sharp edge she had wielded so confidently just minutes earlier. Eastwood paused, the ghost of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, but not one of arrogance. It was something gentler, wiser. "That's the thing about expectations," he said, voice still carrying that gravelly weight of experience. "They're not reality." It wasn't a victory lap. It was simply the truth. And that, somehow, was far more devastating than any pointed remark could have been. The conversation was done for him. He turned, making his way slowly but steadily toward the exit, leaving Riley standing amidst the remnants of the confrontation. The once dominant host was now left to face the reality that sometimes the hardest battles aren't the ones fought in front of cameras. They're the ones waged within, long after the lights go out. But the real storm was just beginning. Outside, the studio walls. Within minutes of the episode ending, social media ignited like a spark to dry timber. Clips of Eastwood's calm defiance and the powerful story behind his cross spread like wildfire. Every platform was flooded with commentary, analysis, and reactions from viewers who hadn't expected to feel moved by a man many had dismissed as a relic of a different era. The moment that shattered the internet wasn't a fiery exchange or a shouting match. It was Eastwood's unwavering calm, his quiet assertion of standing for something greater than himself. And that single phrase, "If you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything," became a rallying cry, echoing across timelines and news feeds. For Riley, the fallout was swift and complicated. Her loyal followers defended her fiercely, arguing that she had done her job, challenging outdated ideas, and holding firm to progressive values. But underneath that support, a more uncomfortable conversation began to take shape. Critics and casual viewers alike questioned whether she had truly listened, or if she had merely tried to steamroll a man who wasn't there to debate, but to share. The comments were merciless in their honesty. This wasn't a win for Riley. She looked outmatched by grace, not aggression. Eastwood didn't argue. He stood firm. There's power in that. For the first time in her career, Riley wasn't just grappling with external criticism. She was wrestling with doubt. Alone in her dressing room, she scrolled through the endless flood of reactions, each one chipping away at the certainty she had built her reputation upon. The confrontation had been her plan, a strategic moment designed to challenge the old guard and cement her dominance in the arena of modern discourse. But what she hadn't anticipated, what she couldn't have anticipated, was the emotional resonance of Eastwood's story. It wasn't the politics that had undone her, it was the humanity, his loss, his faith, his unflinching ability to carry decades of hardship without bitterness. That's what had struck a chord with millions of viewers around the world. And then there was the cross. That simple, unassuming object had become a symbol overnight. Not of religious dogma or political ideology, but of something purer: resilience, loyalty, and the enduring power of personal belief. Viewers weren't just reacting to an interview. They were responding to a man who had shown that strength isn't always loud and that conviction doesn't need validation. As the hours passed, Eastwood's words echoed across every major news outlet, dissected and discussed by commentators who recognized the magnitude of what had unfolded on Exposing the Agenda. It wasn't just a cultural moment, it was a reckoning. And yet, amidst the chaos, Eastwood remained untouched by the frenzy. In a quiet hotel room, far from the blinding lights of the studio and the noise of the digital world, he sat by the window, the city skyline sprawling endlessly before him. The cross rested against his chest, its presence familiar and grounding. He hadn't gone there to win a fight. He hadn't gone there to prove anything. For Clint Eastwood, this wasn't about politics or public perception. It was about standing, firm in what mattered, even when the world around him tried to convince him otherwise. And that was the victory Riley never saw coming. The next morning, headlines crowned Eastwood as an unexpected voice of quiet authority, proof that relevance isn't defined by age or modern trends, but by the timelessness of authenticity and truth. Riley, meanwhile, faced her own reflection with a kind of brutal honesty she wasn't accustomed to. The confrontation had changed her, not by breaking her, but by forcing her to question the very nature of the battles she chose to fight. The episode would go down in history, not as a takedown, but as a masterclass in grace under pressure. A reminder that true power doesn't always shout. It doesn't need to. And as Clint Eastwood's legacy carved itself a little deeper into the fabric of cultural history, one thing became clear. Legends don't need to defend themselves. They simply stand, unwavering, and let the world remember why they became legends in the first place. The aftermath of the interview unfolded like the slow descent of an unexpected storm, inevitable, far-reaching, and utterly unstoppable. What began as a single evening's broadcast had morphed into a cultural phenomenon overnight, igniting debates across every major media platform, dinner table, and boardroom. Clint Eastwood's appearance on Exposing the Agenda wasn't just a viral moment. It was something far more profound. It was a seismic ripple through the landscape of public discourse, a reminder of the enduring power of conviction and the quiet strength of those who didn't need to shout to be heard. But for Riley Morgan, the aftermath felt like standing in the center of that storm, battered, unsteady, and for the first time in her career, unsure of where she truly stood. The headlines were relentless. Eastwood silences. Critics with timeless wisdom. When silence speaks louder. Eastwood's masterclass on conviction. The narrative was clear. This wasn't the takedown Riley had orchestrated. It was something entirely different. A reckoning she hadn't anticipated. Her loyalists tried to spin it in her favor, framing the confrontation as a brave attempt to challenge outdated ideals. Yet beneath the surface, a different conversation was bubbling. Viewers, many who had never connected with Eastwood's politics or worldview, found themselves reflecting on his message. Not necessarily on his conservatism, but on the raw, human truth of his words. It wasn't about left or right. It wasn't about ideology. It was about standing for something when everything around you demanded that you yield. And for Riley, that realization was as bitter as it was humbling. Days passed, then weeks. The frenzy of public reaction didn't fade as quickly as she'd hoped. Everywhere she went, people asked her about that interview. Not about her points, her challenges, or her intellectual prowess, but about him. The cracks were beginning to show, not just in her public image, but in something deeper, her certainty. The foundation she had built her career on wasn't crumbling, but for the first time she began to wonder if it had ever been as solid as she believed. There was no catastrophic fall from grace, no canceled shows, no public disgrace, but something quieter, more insidious, doubt, and it lingered like smoke in the back of her mind, curling into her thoughts during every quiet moment. It was nearly a month after the broadcast when she received an unexpected letter. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. No, grand public statement or media stunt. Just a simple envelope with her name written in neat, deliberate handwriting. No return address, no elaborate introduction, just a folded sheet of paper and a message that was short and cutting in its simplicity. Conviction isn't about being right, it's about being true. Sometimes losing a fight teaches you more than winning ever could. C.E. Riley stared at the letter for what felt like hours. There was no malice in those words, no arrogance, just an undeniable truth that hit harder than any public critique ever could. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in her desk drawer, not as a trophy or a reminder of defeat, but as something closer to a challenge. A moment of reckoning she couldn't ignore. Meanwhile, Clint Eastwood, unaffected by the media whirlwind, returned to his quiet life, unbothered, unshaken, and, as always, steadfast. His presence on the show hadn't been a calculated attempt at relevance. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone. For Eastwood, it was just another moment where he stood by what mattered, without apology, without fanfare. But the world had changed around him. In the weeks that followed, the cultural impact of the interview deepened. It became more than a trending topic. It became a symbol of the divide between loud, reactionary discourse and the timeless power of conviction. A reminder that real influence isn't measured by followers or viral moments, but by the ability to endure, to stand. News outlets couldn't stop dissecting every word, every glance exchanged during that interview. Opinion pieces flooded in from every angle, some praising Eastwood's composure, others defending Riley's aggressive approach, but all acknowledging one undeniable truth. Something rare had happened on that stage. A legend had reminded the world why he was a legend, but perhaps the most unexpected change was in Riley herself. She didn't apologize. She didn't need to. What she did was far more difficult. She listened. For the first time in her career, she allowed herself to reflect not just on the outcome, but on why she had lost control that night. It wasn't because Clint Eastwood was louder, faster, or better prepared. It wasn't even because his beliefs were stronger. It was because he had something she didn't realize she lacked until that moment: unshakable conviction rooted in experience. In the following months, exposing the agenda took on a different tone. The show didn't soften, but it evolved. Riley began approaching her guests with less arrogance and more curiosity, not just challenging their views, but seeking to understand the foundation of their beliefs. She didn't abandon her values. Instead, she fortified them with something stronger than intellectual sharpness: humility. The audience noticed. Viewership didn't drop. It grew. People tuned in not just for confrontation, but for the depth of conversation that had been missing. Before, Riley's toughest critics began to respect her ability to adapt, to learn, and most importantly, to grow. And though she never spoke publicly about the letter, those closest to her noticed a shift, a newfound steadiness beneath the fire. It was as if that single quiet encounter with Eastwood had unearthed something she didn't even know she needed. Not a lesson in debate, but a reminder of what it meant to believe in something so deeply that no challenge could shake it. As for Eastwood, the storm around him eventually faded, as it always did. The world moved on, chasing the next scandal, the next viral sensation. But for those who had watched that interview, truly watched it, the memory lingered. It wasn't about politics. It wasn't about winning. It was about standing tall, even when the winds of time tried to bend you, about carrying your scars with quiet pride and wearing your beliefs like armor, not for defense, but as a reminder of who you are. The legacy of that night wasn't written in headlines or social media posts. It was written in the hearts of those who realized that true strength doesn't come from shouting the loudest. It comes from standing still when the world tells you to move. And for Riley Morgan, that night wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something far more powerful than victory. It was the start of understanding what it truly meant to stand for something.